Halo Combat Evolved's success launched the Xbox brand and solidified not just Microsoft's place in the console market, but the viability of FPSs on console going forward. This meant that Bungie was under a lot of pressure to deliver with the sequel, and the team certainly felt that pressure, leading to a notoriously tough time in development. Waypoint's winding, extensive oral history of Halo gives us some insight into the process right from the developers themselves. Halo 1 had also taken quite a toll on the team at Bungie, and so going into Halo 2, leadership, especially Jason Jones, a co-founder of Bungie who was the project lead on Halo 1 and 2, was worn out and quote, not well. Scattered or eroding communication combined with major overscoping of the campaign and the departure of Alex Seropian, the company's founder, led to rising tensions amongst the team and a lack of direction. Work on a massive multiplayer mode went on for months only to be completely scrapped. The infamous 2003 E3 demo, marveled at by crowds, losing their minds at the added features, was all smoke and mirrors. The graphics engine it was made on had to be thrown out wholesale, as it would never be viable to use on an original Xbox. The rewriting of this engine meant that designers and artists were left crafting concepts they had no way to truly test or implement. At one point, Jason Jones began leading another project Bungie was working on, before that team was folded into Halo 2's development. All of these factors led to levels being only a fraction of the size they had originally been designed to be, to people crunching 7 days a week for months on end, sleeping at their desks, waking up at home or the office with no recollection of how they got there. To a game with its third act completely gutted and removed. Paul Bertone, the design lead for Halo 2, says in that oral history that it was basically a death march to the end. Nobody will say anything different, and if they do, they're just trying to sugarcoat it. Despite this, Halo 2 was the success it needed to be. Reviews were incredibly positive, and it basically propelled the Xbox Live service to prominence, keeping a steady player base well into even the Xbox 360's lifespan with its multiplayer. Similar to Halo 1, I have some faint memories of playing it at a friend's place, but didn't truly get stuck into it until the Master Chief Collection came out, though I've since played it through roughly 7 or 8 times. It is a pretty classic video game sequel. It generally feels more fleshed out and developed on the gameplay side, with an increase of scope and stakes on the narrative side. However, it does have its detractors, with some left disappointed by the campaign. This should make it an interesting one to look back on, but before we get to doing that, a brief reminder of where we left off in Halo 1. After fleeing the besieged Pillar of Autumn and landing on Halo, Master Chief and Cortana attempted to counter the Covenant's attacks, along the way rescuing Marines and Captain Keyes. As they learn more about the ring structure, the Flood is released, a parasitic hive mind that exists only to infect. Master Chief, under the instruction of the ring's AI, 343 Guilty Spark, almost activates Halo, though is stopped by Cortana, as she's discovered that although the ring will stop the Flood, it will do so by killing off its food source, that being all sentient life in the galaxy. In order to stop the Flood's spread and prevent the Covenant from doing a genocide by firing the ring, as the aliens believe it has great religious significance, Cortana and Master Chief self-destruct the Pillar of Autumn, in the process destroying Halo, believing themselves to be the only survivors. If you'd like a more detailed analysis of Halo 1, I recommend you watch my video on it if you haven't already. Wink wink. Additionally, I will reference observations I made in that video in this one as well, so as to create points of comparison and contrast between the two games. So again, watch my Combat Evolved video if you want to get the absolute most out of this one. Now, let's finally get to analysing Halo 2. The title screen shows a presumably human city presided over by an enormous Covenant cruiser as explosions ring out amongst the buildings. The familiar strings and chants of Halo's music returns, but instead of coaxing curiosity and awe around a beautiful installation like in Halo CE, it now conjures up a slow sadness, the sweeping camera movements documenting the enormity of the imminent destruction. This tone prioritizes power, loss, and drama, an appropriate setup for what's to come. This image of decimation continues once the campaign actually starts up, an establishing shot of the ruined ring from Halo 1 panning to reveal the Covenant city of High Charity. Inside, an elite commander relays why he was unable to stop Master Chief from destroying Halo, though the Covenant prophets, named Truth, Mercy and Regret, along with a surrounding crowd of Covenant, are left unconvinced. The elite's labelled a heretic and taken into custody. This scene does a few really important things. Primarily, it gives us insight into the Covenant. In Halo 1 they were important, but existed mainly as a threat, with little definition beyond their theologically motivated reverence for the ring and a representation of the ignorance Master Chief had to learn to discard. Here we see their inner workings. The three prophets wield power and seem to want to keep it. As such, they have to find someone to blame for their loss. That blame falls on this elite's shoulders despite his obvious loyalty, and based on our experience in Combat Evolved, his explanation for why he didn't stop Master Chief seems reasonable. Nevertheless, he's still labelled a heretic by the leaders themselves and the mob that observes the judgment. As far as we know, he hasn't subverted any of the religious doctrine the Covenant follow in his failure. It's a strategic shortcoming, not a spiritual one. Yet he's branded a heretic all the same, showing that within the Covenant hegemony, threatening leadership in the power structure earns you disdain and disparagement tantamount to religious subversion. This setting up of the Covenant operations will form a baseline for the game's exploration of power, and particularly how it overlaps with religious organisation. Outside of these larger thematic implications, a few central characters are set up here as well. We obviously see the Prophet's cruelty and loyalty to dominance, but also the elite's pride, refusing to be held by the arms by the brute guards. The brutes themselves seem to be a new addition to the hegemony, and we see one named Tartarus laugh smugly as the elite is cast aside. Contrasting this cutscene is the reintroduction of Master Chief. The elite stood in shame, trying to justify himself in an ultimately futile gesture. Meanwhile, Master Chief's only repercussions for his actions in Halo 1 are that he damaged his armor, something he dismisses with a single line.
Tell that to the Covenant.
Then, whereas the last game ended with Chief taking his helmet off, control is reinstated in this one with him putting it back on. With some new armor, the calibration test must be completed once more. It's very similar to the one from Halo CE, establishing camera controls and some changes to the UI, most importantly the presence of armor above the radar and the lack of a health system, now just made up purely of shields. It's a believable and ultimately short way to get the player used to controlling Chief again. A success, I'd say. Sergeant Johnson, who somehow survived Halo 1, then takes you through the Cairo defense station to see Lord Hood. This sequence lets you stew in what you and Master Chief saved during the last game. There's relative peace, and the defense station itself is one of 300, with massive ballistic capabilities, displaying how humanity won't be caught off guard by the Covenant like last time. This is all building the legend of the Master Chief further, building him up the same way we saw the elite broken down. In comes some triumphant horns and military drums as you're met with the crowd for a ceremony to celebrate the success of dealing with Halo. The duality and divergence between Master Chief and the elite are strengthened further, as we see Chief made into a symbol of hope. UNSC troops cheer on his victory, while the Covenant cheer on the elite's supposed betrayal. Sergeant Johnson and Miranda Keyes, Captain Keyes' daughter, are seen dressed up, contrasted by the elite who's dressed down and stripped of his armor. Medals of honor are pinned to the UNSC garb, juxtaposed by the symbol of shame that the elite is branded by, burnt into his flesh, never to be forgotten. This is showing the damage that organized, dogmatic religious doctrine can do, but I think this is also highlighting dynamics of power more generally. In one perspective it's instilled and given, and in another mocked and taken. It sets up how these characters will be treated by the narrative, and on some level informs us of the gameplay and mission design to come. This is a great sequence that's thematically rich, establishing a dual perspective dynamic that'll carry through the entire game. The ceremony is interrupted on the UNSC side as Cortana picks up some invading Covenant ships. Lord Hood states that the fleet almost seems too small, but it's a threat nonetheless, so Master Chief is sent off to defend the station. The Pillar of Autumn, Combat Evolved's first mission, kept you boxed into the ship so as to give you a more controlled environment in which to get you accustomed to Halo's gameplay. This does a similar thing, but this time you're merely getting used to the gameplay again, not learning it wholesale. As such, the spaces on Cairo are a little broader than that of the Autumn. There's room to jump around and strafe more, with less tight corridors. You start off with two new weapons, the Battle Rifle, or BR, meant to replace the pistol, and the SMG, meant to replace the Assault Rifle. The Halo 1 pistol, as magical as it was, felt a bit like a handgun that had been modified for higher damage output and longer range in order to fit into the gap of Halo's sandbox, that being precision weapons. The Battle Rifle, on the other hand, feels purpose-built for precision play. Its burst fire, 2x scope and low spread all make it incredibly effective at mid to long range with decent coverage for short range as well. It has a really satisfying rhythm of fire, with a decent capacity magazine that allows you to take out groups of Covenant in a way that the Halo 1 pistol didn't, as it felt a bit slower to operate. With the BR having so much versatility, the SMG is manifested as what feels like a generally less powerful version of the Assault Rifle. It still holds plenty of bullets that it then expounds rather rapidly, but lacks some of the AR's heft. At the same time though, its recoil is pretty intense. You have to fight it more in order to stay in control. This discourages extended use and helps establish the dynamic between these two weapons. They're pretty much the backbone of the UNSC sandbox, with the BR being the primary weapon, proving effective against anything at most ranges. That's then switched out with the SMG when you need to clean up the dregs of the combat encounter using measured bursts of fire. It's a really fun combo of weapons that, when used correctly, absolutely clean up on the battlefield, truly feeling the strength that the Master Chief has been bestowed by their narrative as you take down invading aliens amongst the station. During a lull, you see that another of the defense stations, the Malta, seems to have fended off the Covenant, only for it to be blown to bits moments later. The Covenant weren't retreating, they were just getting away from the bomb they'd planted. This is a really great moment and gives the mission a narrative arc that works in with gameplay. As you get reacquainted with playing Halo and these two new weapons, you steadily deal with the Covenant threat, seeming to push them to retreat. But then the true nature of their offensive is revealed, your goal is recontextualized. Without any cinematics, a fantastic sense of urgency is instilled into your play. As this happens, nebulous, shimmering synth sees in, and as you push forward, the dynamic is sort of flipped, much like the first mission of Halo 1. You find that Covenant have set up turrets and energy shields, ready to ward you off so they can plant their bomb. You really start to feel up against it, right at the moment at which you've figured out gunplay again, and are ready to truly deal some carnage. The mission's plot and gameplay beats coalesce perfectly for a second half full of satisfying battles fueled by narrative motivation. You eventually meet up with Johnson and Keyes, then head off to take care of the bomb. The pace is unfortunately broken a little by a meandering elevator sequence, but the moments of action remain fun, ending with a tussle against the group of elites guarding the Covenant bomb. Once they're eliminated, Master Chief disarms it, and in a completely absurd sequence, free dives through space with a bomb into a Covenant cruiser. He then rearms it and pushes off it to float into the UNSC in-amber-clad frigate as the Covenant ship explodes behind him. It's on a completely different level of theatrics than anything from Halo 1 and is rife with one-liners, close calls that he coolly ignores, and a reaffirmation of the power he's been granted narratively. He's essentially become the sort of parodic legend you could imagine him being in the eyes of UNSC troops, as the story of his accomplishments gets exacerbated in a game of space telephone. The way he's been built up and looked upon by those around him almost gives him the capacity to pull off these ridiculous stunts, and will serve as another point of contrast later on.
The message just repeats. Regret, regret, regret.
Keyes and Johnson were also on the in-amber-clad and ask him to get inside as they head to Earth. Cortana intercepts a message from the cruiser chief damaged with the bomb, called Solemn Penance. It's a call for help from the Prophet of Regret, who runs the ship. He'll know why the Covenant landed here, so it's our mission to capture him. After shaking off a crash landing thanks to a scarab tank, you move throughout the city of New Mombasa to reach the cruiser. Emerging into a ruined courtyard, you have to take out a few waves of Covenant before hunters blow open some doors to provide a way forward. The area is really well designed, as it's built to highlight the place I think Halo 2 improved gameplay the absolute most, that being movement. In my Halo CE video, I established how combat in the series is about working within the space, creating angles and lines of sight to best take out each alien with the weapons at your disposal. Cover is really only used when you absolutely need to recharge shields. Other than that, the game wants you to be moving and shooting. This is encouraged by the 2-weapon limit and finite ammo, making for an improvisational, adaptive, scrappy mode of gunplay, where you pick up and put down weapons quite regularly, discovering combos amongst each one's strengths and weaknesses. This approach to FPS combat, however, failed to quite deliver on verticality in Halo 1. Jumping was sluggish and heavy, spaces weren't designed to be navigated in that way. But, with the improvement in movement, Halo 2 is. Master Chief now feels snappier and bouncier. Jumps have little lead up, like he just spring off the ground. So with correct timing and using crouch jumps to get some extra height, you can essentially chain them together to efficiently move from place to place. You'll see in this footage that I'm constantly jumping around. It just feels fun to do, and literally adds a whole new dimension to this spatial emphasized combat. You feel more unpredictable and free within any given area, and this creates a sort of domino effect on other sensations of gunplay. Being more nimble and proactive spurred me to speed things up in general. I'd regularly switch and reload my guns to make sure I was best prepared for what's to come next. Grenades, also feeling better thanks to more character in their physics and weight, were no longer just a way to kill things, but also a way to disrupt an area so I could jump in and finish everything off. Melee is snappier as well, becoming more viable as a staggering technique, also being given some lunge so that you don't have to be right up on an enemy to execute it. These ideas all existed in Halo 1, but just not to this extent. Master Chief's movement adds dimension to the framework of fights to make them more exciting. Moving on from the courtyard, Johnson hops into another Pelican to provide air support, leaving you all alone. It gives you a moment of quiet to look around and realize, this game kinda looks like shit. In many quantifiable ways, it's of course better. Higher polygon count, some more complex lighting, textures and so on, but man, the art direction is pretty grim. Literally. New Mombasa is in South Africa, so the dry, arid feel makes sense, but this goes beyond that. The buildings are all grey and beige, the Covenant ships lack some of their signature shine and polish. The materials all have this pocked, gritty feel to them that makes them blend together in a dull way. Overall, the colour palette is way more muted across the whole experience, lacking that freshness and richness that Combat Evolved had. As a result, environments often look flat and aren't really compelling you to explore them at all. Maybe this was a result of the rushed development and scrapped graphics engine, as there are a few graphical features from the E3 demo missing in the final product, but regardless, it ultimately results in a less appealing game to me on an art level. Fortunately, I think this was vastly improved in the remaster from 2014, which was almost 10 years ago now. Holy fuck, good god. It's not really all that much more colourful or diverse, but improvements in lighting and shadow work allow for greater interplay amongst objects in the environment, adding that depth that I think is lacking in the original release. When you switch between both of them, it really does feel like someone accidentally bumped the brightness down on the whole thing right before they shipped off the game in 2004. Don't get me wrong, there are parts that look good in the original, like this moment from the previous mission, but the art direction and graphics are just lacking, leading to not just some ugly visuals, but at times levels and environments that are hard to read and pass. As you move throughout the city, Cortana locates a bridge that goes directly to the city centre and just below the Covenant cruiser. In your effort to get there, you emerge onto the coastline and head along the shore with some Marines. The Warthog feels very similar to Halo 1, but the Ghost has some notable improvements. It has more heft and glide to it, there's a greater sense of speed and power. These changes help it to slot firmly into a dual role. Not only can it deal damage at range, but also splatter enemies up close, being able to weave around obstacles in the process. It's a cool use case for a vehicle, playing into Halo's emphasis on spatial combat, while having the sort of firepower and protection you'd expect from a vehicle. These parts where you fight along the coast are really great, imparting a fantastic sense of forward momentum, laced with exhilarating encounters. This, unfortunately, simmers down to a formulaic trudge through a long tunnel, before emerging onto the bridge Cortana mentioned earlier. Sergeant drops off a tank so you can cross the bridge, along the way blasting ghosts, wraiths and banshees to bits. It's another slow-moving, repetitive section of gameplay, and to me represents larger problems with Halo 2's level design. Most pressingly is the linearity and lack of exploration. Even when you were just moving from A to B in Halo 1, those paths had some breadth and room to breathe in them. Optional small structures or buildings could be found and explored, or multiple routes of approach were made available, but Halo 2 really fails to capture that. This tank section on the bridge is bigger and grander than that of Combat Evolved, but it's also restrictive, repetitive, and languishing. This can be the case on foot as well throughout the campaign, as you find yourself struggling through identical rooms many times over, or being locked in an arena to fight waves of enemies for 5 to 10 minutes. Level design just generally feels more contrived in Halo 2. There's less of a sense of naturalism or authenticity to the locations. New Mombasa doesn't really feel like a city. You can't imagine how these buildings and streets would thread and fit together. Instead, it's a video game level surrounded by buildings to try and trick you into thinking it's a city. I can see some rationale for this design. The improvements to gunplay I've mentioned can be felt most pressingly when you're in an arena, figuring out the different ways to navigate it as each wave approaches. So this tighter, more boxed-in design makes some sense, playing into gameplay strengths. And as mentioned in the introduction, levels were originally supposed to be much larger. Perhaps much of the cut content was that more open and exploratory stuff, which, by the way, some of that is present in Halo 2. So it's not as though the levels are all without redeeming qualities, it's just not as strong or compelling as Halo 1. In fact, one minor example is later on in this level. You leave some sort of building courtyard and find yourself in the city centre. The interplay of strings and piano gives it a sense of rise and fall, with a grounded, pulsing floor to push you forward.
There are a number of Marines trapped in that building, Chief. Concentrate on the wraiths, they're the biggest threat.
UNSC and Covenant fight in the streets, and you're given some room to actually move around. In an awesome sequence, I destroyed one wraith, boarded another, punched out the driver, took it over, and then eliminated the remaining Covenant in the area. It was exhilarating, there was a legitimate sense of place, it felt real and important. It's just that this sensation isn't as prevalent in this game. These moments feel fleeting and unfortunately rare. I think part of what hurts the level design further is a lack of narrative motivation. You really want to know about the ring in Halo 1, so even the slower repetitive sections are pushing you onwards on some level. But to be honest, I don't care that much about how the Covenant found out about Earth. That question has important implications, but none as interesting to me as the Halo ring itself. Beyond that, motivation could be made up for by some more character work, but that isn't present here either. Sure, the trio of Chief, Cortana and Johnson quip back and forth, and the dialogue from the Marines is fun, but there's zero development here. The player's under no impression that continued progress is going to lead to character growth or revelations. These elements can't excuse dull level design, but they can distract from it to some extent, yet they're really just lacking in Halo 2 so far. For this mission at least, things do stay engaging. You enter the buildings at the end of the street and find the Scarab tank advancing towards you and some other Marines. You follow as it climbs over the building, soon jumping onto its back. The main theme's injected with some crunchy, fuzzy guitar as you blast your way through the Covenant troops on board. It's chaotic and blood-pumping, a really fantastic way of translating the idea of a boss fight into a Halo game. There's an objective to taking down this single larger enemy while still tapping into the moment-to-moment fun of Halo that comes from sandbox interaction. With it taken care of, the Covenant cruiser starts to take off. Sergeant picks up Chief and they get back on board the in amber clad. The Solemn Penance is going to slip space jump, so Keyes pursues it, not knowing where they'll get spit out. They narrowly make it, New Mombasa being ravaged in the burst of energy triggered by the disruption.
How much further must we heft this baggage? Any cell will do. Why not toss it in with this lot?
The elite from earlier is dragged before the Prophet of Truth and Mercy by some brutes. Instead of executing the elite, Truth decides to make him the next Arbiter, a historically prestigious rank amongst elites, which eventually became a mark of shame, given to those seen as irredeemable and sent on merciless missions. This is another manipulation of power. The Covenant religion is so fiercely enforced that failures like the now Arbiters, that the prophets themselves admit do not signify heresy, are seen as opportunities to make examples of, while getting the subject to fight as hard as they can in a vain attempt to recapture their honour and integrity. You can see this further in some of the dialogue. Arbiters have been used to quell inter-hegemony uprisings and conflicts, a tool of those at the top to solidify their dominance and retain the status quo. In this case, the Arbiter is being sent to eliminate a defected sect of the Covenant who reject the Great Journey. True heretics. The Arbiter is sent to the facility with a group of high-ranking elites, excluded from their chance, seen as disposable. This threat of rejection continues into gameplay. A raging storm nearby has kept you undiscovered, and you're encouraged to use the Arbiter's on-command active camouflage to pursue combat silently. This accents encounters across the game as you play as the Arbiter. It imparts drawn-out moments of silence, implores you to hide the Arbiter away, sink into the shadows. This mirrors his position of shame and failure, minimizing his visibility within the Covenant while still pursuing his objective. As it turns out, the reason there had been no character work thus far is because it all really exists within the Arbiter. The missions where you play as him feel more character-led, as we'll see. I'm glad his missions are like that, but it does mean that when you're playing as Master Chief, the only thematic significance he really has is as a point of contrast to the Arbiter. This generally makes his missions feel less meaningful on a narrative level, but admittedly that contrast is compelling now that we've made the switch in perspective for the first time. Like I mentioned, the Arbiter's combat encounters emphasize consideration and moments of calm, combined with the default weapon spawn of an energy sword, which necessitates closer combat that's presumably more dangerous as well, displaying how he feels disposable. Although I like the thematic implications of gameplay, it doesn't always pan out. Just like Halo 1, stealth is not really systematized in any official ways. There's no measure of true visibility, sound, and stages of alert for enemies, so actually pulling off sequences of stealth kills is quite tough. This means that while the tone of combat can feel different for the Arbiter, for the most part it only does so for 10 to 15 seconds of each fight, before you're found out and back to blasting your way through everything again. On some level this seems to have been accounted for. The music at different parts of this level starts out soft and refined as you skulk around silently before layering in drums, matching the inevitably loud combat once you reveal yourself.
Maintain discipline.
There are aesthetic differences to playing as the Arbiter, of course. Seeing that elite hand on the screen is odd after being so used to Chiefs, and the curved UI is a nice detail that plays into the Covenant's aesthetic. So while the Arbiter ultimately isn't too different from Master Chief, you are at least aware of the change in perspective while you're playing. The different overarching tone of gameplay never tends to stick around for too long as Arbiter, but the weapons at your disposal help things feel further removed from playing as Master Chief. As you move throughout the facility, you'll get reintroduced to weapons like the plasma pistol and rifle and needler, which have largely stayed the same. Then there are some new weapons like the beam rifle, a sniper rifle equivalent, the Covenant carbine, a battle rifle equivalent, and the fuel rod cannon, a rocket launcher equivalent. Although these three weapons are analogues for UNSC weapons, they manage to feel unique. The carbine is faster but less accurate, the beam rifle overheating is more punishing than having to reload the sniper rifle, and the fuel rod is less powerful but has higher ammo capacity. I think these are great additions. They obviously help Chief and the Arbiter have some parity between sandboxes so the gameplay largely feels familiar, but they're different enough that you can develop preferences for one over the other. I prefer the carbine to the BR, for example. Thanks to the interiors of this level, you get many opportunities to put the sandbox to good use, as it shines the most in tighter environments. So although the Arbiter's symbolic mode of combat doesn't quite stick around for too long, the gameplay remains fun regardless. As you get deeper into the facility, you begin finding sentinels, like those from Halo, which does make you wonder what this place is, also making you realize that the Arbiter himself is never actually told, reinforcing the subservient role he's playing here. Eventually you exit to find some banshees and must systematically take out placed turrets until you close in on the Heretic leader. I appreciate that this area opens up, but I'm really not too fond of the banshee. It's always felt awkward to control. Adding a Z-axis to the Warthog controls makes it kinda cumbersome, and it often feels less like you're flying and more like you're floating. It's also quite fragile, with projectile-based weapons which can actually make hitting things pretty tough. This results in a laborious crawl around the facility that never feels as intense or hectic as the uncharacteristically synth-laden music would like to imply. Once all those turrets and Covenant are taken out, you narrow down the leader's position and exit the Banshee. The Arbiter heads back inside to further pursue the sorry, I was interrupted. You're back to looking for the Heretic leader on foot again is all I was saying. But these interruptions to load what are considered new levels does really remind you that a lot was cut out, and tend to break up the flow a bit, making for unceremonious, anticlimactic ends to missions.
I've smelled it before.
That being said, the beginning of this mission is fantastic. It reintroduces the Flood with a distinct frigid mistiness and stained, sterilized look, seeing the silhouettes fight beneath you. As you survey rooms filled with corpses, the music comes in, chiming away like the doors opening, as though revealing something. At the same time, the drums have that familiar military feel, but are softer and pulled back, like the parasite is waiting to strike somewhere in the shadows. These are the quiet moments that I feel have been missing so far, so it's refreshing to finally get some. A hologram of the Heretic leader buzzes into view, seeing who exactly has been sent after him. All the while, infection-formed floods swarm the room, reanimating the bodies that line the floor. You immediately realize that these Covenant weapons do not have coverage for the Flood the same way that the ballistic-based UNSC ones do. The game uses your knowledge of the sandbox to emphasize the Arbiter's relative weakness or lack of power in comparison to Master Chief. One concession has been made. The energy sword is effective and retains energy for longer against the Flood, but nevertheless you feel ill-equipped. You continue into a large elevator, the elements of fear and tension being held taut, but it unfortunately dissipates as the elevator ride proves to be another slow, wave-based exercise in tedium. It really kills much of the mission's momentum, failing to capitalize on its excellent start. Proceeding deeper into the facility, you continue to take down the Flood, as well as the Covenant heretics, who also seem to have been caught off guard by the parasites. As you do so, the storm outside worsens, the Heretic leader needing to be killed as soon as possible so you can still make it out safely. Following him inside, he locks himself behind an energy door, which is bullshit by the way. I took out his shields and then stuck him with the grenade before I got it up. He should be dead, but I guess it was a dud! With the leader locked behind the door, the elites are unsure what to do. The Arbiter comes up with a plan, cut the station loose by destroying a cable and in doing so power it down. He sends the other elites back outside so they can get picked up by a phantom. This is an important moment. So far, the Arbiter has felt like the tag-along. The other elites all move in before you and are working under their leader's command. When playing as the Arbiter these past 2 levels, you've kind of felt like the equivalent of one of the Marines that join up with Chief now and then. So him taking some ownership over the situation is important. It shows him regaining himself and his authority, though at the moment it's still mostly motivated by a wish to be redeemed, living up to the mortal legends of the Arbiters of past. But this mindset of his will develop further as we progress and prove influential when looking back. This translates to gameplay. As you ascend to cut the cable, you feel more powerful, taking everything out of your own accord, no other elites contributing. The momentum of the mission is re-injected as you ascend, cutting through the wires with your energy sword and sending the station into freefall. You head back down, following briefly in a Banshee in a weird little Halo 1 reference, before finally confronting him as he attempts to leave. The Heretic leader shows the Arbiter that he learned the truth about the Great Journey through none other than the floating dirtbag known as 343 Guilty Spark. The Covenant revere him as an oracle, a bringer of knowledge and prophecy, so I'd imagine this connection paints the Heretics with an inkling of legitimacy in the Arbiter's eyes. The Heretic still ultimately hopes to escape though, using holograms as diversions while you fight him. Yeah, there's no point trying to write dramatically about this despite how the game presents it. This fight is a fucking joke. The Heretic leader's still just an elite at the end of the day, so killing him takes all of 25 seconds. It's no scarab tank when it comes to bosses. Once the leader is dead, Tartarus swoops in, snatching 343 for himself and bringing the Arbiter with him, taking all the credit while doing none of the work.
Oracle. So it is. Come, you're leading this system.
We then cut back to the in amber clad, following the solemn penance to what turned out to be another Halo ring.
Say what?
Holy chants ease in and Miranda directs Chief and Johnson to continue to pursue regret on the ring. As Master Chief drops to the surface of the weapon, he's again prescribed competence, power and respect, as we see a much more composed entering of the ring's atmosphere when compared to the rushed and for some fatal launching in Halo 1. Once landed, you and some Marines storm the ruins in front of you in a really fantastic sequence of gameplay. You get a chance to use the rocket launcher, which now has the capability to lock on, but most importantly is that it justifies the arena wave-based type of combat that's felt so prevalent thus far. You're storming the ring so that you can secure a landing zone for Sergeant Johnson, who's approaching in some Pelicans. This creates a narrative to the encounter where you overcome the threat you're besieging and then have to hold it so you can be provided with support. As you fight waves of Covenant, it doesn't feel like filler, it's been justified by the story in a logical way. There's motive and investment behind it. Speaking of the circumstances here, there's a comparison to be made to the previous 2 missions we played as the Arbiter. Those were also about pursuing a threat to take them out. And though there was occasional support provided, your position felt tenuous and fragile, like no one was really looking out for you. It's the opposite here. Chief is supported by Marines, in regular communication with Amberclad and Johnson, and of course has Cortana as well. You can see a gulf in how these 2 power structures, the UNSC and Covenant hegemony, are treating these 2 subjects. One is accepted and fortified, the other rejected and torn down. But back to the present mission and combat. I really started to warm up to dual wielding at this point. It seems weird that I haven't mentioned this till now, as it was a pretty big deal around release. But it can be a bit conflicting, as its strengths also tie into its weaknesses. Some guns like the SMG, pistol, plasma rifle, plasma pistol and needler can be dual wielded, so you can carry and fire 2 at a time. But beyond this, they can each be dual wielded together, so you could have an SMG and plasma rifle for example. This is great as it essentially allows you to cook up interesting combos like the aforementioned duo, which I found really effective, as I could melt shields with one and then deliver the final blow with another. The ability to mix and match makes the feature dynamic and player driven, adding further complexity and density to player-led decisions within battles. But on the other hand, you can't keep both of these dual-wielded guns on you at once. If you try and switch to your secondary weapon, the most recent firearm you picked up will be dropped. It's the same for if you want to melee or throw a grenade. On some level this is interesting, as it means that there's a trade-off for the extra damage dealing. You have to fight in a new way that focuses on just your weapons. But on the other hand, shaking off the muscle memory to use grenades or melee attacks can be tough to do, so you may find yourself accidentally discarding a dual-wielded weapon pretty regularly, having to find it again and pick it back up. This kinda discourages use of the feature, as by necessity every weapon you can use dual-wielded also has to be decently capable when used in isolation. Dual-wielding is never really necessary or gives you a significant advantage. It can be tons of fun, but may then prove frustrating moments later. This makes it an odd feature that never quite ended up being as big a deal within the franchise as you'd think, and in the particular case of Halo 2, affected multiplayer balancing pretty drastically. But, as I was saying, there's fun to figuring out a cool combo, or to just powering up a single type of weapon, like the Needler, which with its ability to have its projectile needles explode once an enemy is stuck with 5 of them, becomes pretty deadly when double-fisted. It's also worth mentioning that this part of the game looks way better. It's still lacking that verdant crispness of the original Halo ring, but there's at least more life and colour injected here. To me, the rings are so much more inherently compelling than a human city and a formulaic-looking Forerunner facility. Once the Covenant forces are taken care of, Johnson closes in to provide some warthogs, along the way spotting a temple in the distance, which seems to be where Regret would be hiding, so off in that direction you go. The level doesn't quite open up exactly, but it recaptures some of that feeling from Halo 1, of traversing the ring and barreling into combat encounters so you can proceed onward. It just feels great to be on the ring again, and the game manages to reconcile these slightly more open environments with Halo 2's penchant for arena-focused combat, mixing in a way more interesting take segment than the one earlier to make sure it feels like you're actually covering some ground, and using the setting to great effect. There's inherent curiosity to exploring a new Halo ring, especially when this one seems to have ruins that break away from the familiar grey slate of Forerunner architecture. This mission and the one preceding it are the best of the game from a gameplay perspective to me, and show a glimpse of what Halo 3 would hone in on for its level design to great effect. Though that's for another time. After some on-foot action, you come to a dilapidated part of the Forerunner installation.
Good. Still no word about In Amber Clad on the Covenant BattleNet. It's odd. The Covenant know we made landfall, but they don't seem to consider us a very serious threat. Boy, are they in for a big surprise.
A dock for the barges that should take you closer to the temple where Regret resides. In another refreshing departure, you have some of those moments of quiet to observe, see what's in front of you and snipe some enemies from afar before you truly enter the structure. Once you do actually enter and promptly take out the elite zealot guards, Cortana translates a message being broadcast by Regret. He plans to fire the ring, though he'll need to find the index to do it. Thank fuck Miranda offers to be the one to get it, as I really don't want to suffer through another library. Chief just has to take out Regret. I do actually quite like Miranda. She's not a deep character, but she shows herself to be reliable and steadfast like her father, and that part of his legacy existing helps make his sacrifice more meaningful in retrospect. Continuing through the structure, you come to the dock where the gondolas launch from, fending off Covenant as you wait for one of them to arrive. You ride it to a station that should get you nearer to the temple, and then enter an underwater pod to be taken to another section of it. Along the way, Cortana intercepts a transmission from Regret to High Charity, expressing, you guessed it, regret, for how New Mombasa played out. He didn't know that there'd be a human presence on Earth, explaining why the fleet was relatively small. A failure was earned by the Covenant once more through ignorance on their part, the leadership proving fallible amongst each other, but never to those they actually lead so as to maintain power. Once you leave the pod and explore the underwater facility, things get pretty eerie. The Gregorian chants are softer and independent. There's an uneasy quiet to combat with the lack of music, interrupted by Regret's sermons in his native tongue. You've seen through the facade. Regret seems pretty desperate, but he's not allowed to let anyone he leads think so, creating a tension built off dramatic irony that makes for an interesting tone of gameplay. You soon enter another pod to reach surface, Cortana following up from earlier. The Prophet of Truth is resentful of Regret's mishap, though Regret is spared public punishment thanks to, you guessed it, Mercy's mercy. You ride yet another gondola which finally takes you to the temple proper. These are probably the weakest parts of these past two missions, unfortunately rife with the waiting that's been frustrating so far, but the locale and surrounding level design makes them the most tolerable instances of it. Once in the temple, an expansive fleet of Covenant jump into the airspace above, along with High Charity itself. You enter the main chamber and spot Regret, surrounded by grunts and elite zealots. It's initially intimidating, but all you have to do is run up and punch him a few times, before his little floating chair goofily falls to the ground. Now I'd love to transition from this to the end of the mission, but I have to stop and highlight how pathetic this is. This boss is a failure just like the Heretic leader. Halo's fights are a lot about space, as we've covered, always contending with the fluctuating circumstances around the placement of enemies and you yourself, and how those things affect interactions within the sandbox. These boss fights try to tap into that by having the titular enemy intermingled with normal enemies as well, but when you only need to kill a single foe to progress, and not the whole room like usual, the rest can just be ignored. These fights fail to capitalize on combat strengths, proving to be underwhelming and unsatisfying. Once Regret's taken care of, Master Chief rushes to the temple's exit, as the Covenant fleet is preparing to fire on it. He narrowly escapes, jumping into the water below, tendrils reaching up to pull him deeper. We're back in the Arbiter's shoes, who's been brought to high charity by Tartarus. The elites are being stripped of their position, brutes living up to their name as they snatch away the guards' helmets for themselves. You can see a sense of competition even amongst the brutes, making sure to look out for themselves as individuals first. The Spec Ops commander that the Arbiter has been working with tries to protest the decision, but the Prophet of Truth is having none of it. The elites have failed to stop Master Chief, true, but this reads pretty blatantly as a move made out of self-interest by the Prophets. The brutes too are desperate for authority and dominance, demonstrating fealty and unquestioning loyalty, while the elites seem more principled and sincere in their wish to see the Great Journey succeed. The Prophets want guards who will do what they're told without hesitation, so they disempower not just the Arbiter, but now the rest of the elites. Narratively speaking, Halo 2 is primarily a criticism of religion, and yet in most of the thematic analysis I focused on power, dynamics of power, and power structures. That's because Halo 2 is critical of specifically organized religion, even more specifically the organized part of organized religion. The game seems to make a concerted effort to not undermine the theology of the Covenant. There is the underlying thread that they seem to misinterpret things, like how they call 343 an oracle, using religious terms and phrases to describe what are presented to us as rather technical and ideologically barren concepts and ideas. There's a slight intonation that they're imprinting their religious beliefs onto scientific discoveries, two things that are often seen as incongruous by people in our world. But beyond that, the game doesn't criticize their beliefs or theories directly. In fact, when you look at the universe from a perspective rooted in faith, you can see where the Covenant are coming from. These rings are devices capable of completely wiping life out, of irrevocably shaping universes and worlds. It's not too far-fetched to think of the beings capable of building those devices as akin to gods. An oracle is a prophecy, an answer. 343 Guilty Spark, who the Covenant call Oracle, has all the answers about these incredible ring-shaped devices. How are they not just a type of apostle? The fact that the game makes sure not to criticize the Covenant religion is what makes it clear that the critique it is making within the text is not related to those beliefs. It's centered on the hierarchy and power structure built around them instead. It's clearly showing how the Prophets have manipulated faith to in turn manipulate their followers, exploit them, oppress and subjugate them. Halo 2 has a refreshing compassion for the faithful. Many who are critical of religion are too often dismissive or derisive of religious individuals, seeing them as ignorant, weak, or stupid, but Halo 2 understands that good can come from faith. It's the people who seek to twist it for their own gain who deserve that disdain. But again, I think there's a larger extrapolation to be pulled from the game's focus. I believe that the contrast between Master Chief and the Arbiter is not just to show how these religious leaders can use their power to bring down those who threaten or disobey them, but also to create a thread between power structures generally. Militaries are highly regimented and structured. They are top-down operations in which people are expected to follow orders. They are just as capable as empowering corrupt leaders as a religion is. Admittedly, this facet is not nearly as focused on by the game. Maybe this only seems like a connection to me because of my own opinions and beliefs around military action and war generally. But it just seems to me that the blatant empowering of Master Chief in this game, how he's framed by the events around him and treated by his peers, is showing how these power structures can become so appealing, as they make martyrs and legends out of their most faithful, unquestioning adherents. On one hand, the game is criticizing organized religion and how its despots can tear people down in order to retain power. But on the other, it's extrapolating these characteristics to power structures generally, showing how they get their hooks into people in the first place. Sorry, I know that was sudden, but this cutscene is a great crystallization of the game's points to me, and is far enough along in the story that hopefully you can think back to what we've covered and see where I'm coming from. So, back to the cutscene. In a subtle touch, we see how the Prophet's greed sows dissent amongst the people they seek to punish and disempower. The Spec Ops commander openly disagrees with the decision to promote the brutes, and while passing the Arbiter gives a small nod, a sign of growing respect and solidarity, a stark difference to the blatant disregard he had for the Arbiter's life while hunting down the Heretic leader. You then see Truth and Mercy play their parts well, acting wounded and personally broken up by the elite's failure to protect the ring, then reinforcing their ability to continue on through channeling their faith in the Great Journey, and implicitly the upholding of the status quo as it pertains to hierarchy and power. This is the type of talk that has victims blame themselves and invest further into their own exploitation. They finally top this off by positioning this deeper investment into the faith, organized faith remember, as a good thing, as in the process they found another Halo ring. This little speech gives insight into how these prophets must be projecting themselves to the whole hegemony, and shows off their tactics while again plainly criticizing the organizing of religion under strict dynamics of power, rather than the religion itself. Guilty Spark ended up telling the prophets about the Index, as they hope to fire Delta Halo, and retrieving it is to become the Arbiter's next mission. In order to enter the library, the shield protecting it must first be lowered. The mission starts off rather low-key, walking amongst the ring's innards, dropping down pipes that run through it to reach the shield generators, along the way seeing many Covenant and Brute corpses. It's a nice sense of build-up before you come to the generator guarded by an enforcer. These big Forerunner guards are a good way to force use of the active camo, playing into its short runtime, meaning you have to use it well if you want to get right around the back of the enforcer and take it out. Once it's taken care of, you're free to open the locks of the generator. With the shields down, you're carried across a wide chasm as this angelic music plays. It's a simple thing, but seeing how different this ring is while still containing the same underlying characteristics is really cool, and is a well the game can continue to dive into thanks to how curious the first game made players about the world. Unfortunately, the mission kinda falls apart after this for a bit. Although you've managed to avoid reliving the accursed library from the first game, the path towards it in this one isn't much better. The Flood are still best dealt with by the shotgun, and this section proves to be quite formulaic. There are cool aspects like hearing UNSC Marines getting infected, the first hint of these two perspectives crossing over, and the environment becoming steadily more smoggy from the Flood. But this section is tedious and repetitive, fortunately coming to an end as you exit out into this gorgeous vista of the Flood Covenant battlefield. You make your way across it and meet back up with the Spec Ops commander.
In the center of this zone is a sacred icon critical to the Great Journey. I must find it.
The commander, his battalion, and the Arbiter are to move further in to retrieve the icon as a unit. This burgeoning respect for the Arbiter amongst elites is very important, as it shows the disillusionment they're having with the Prophets as translating to a re-evaluation of other aspects of the hegemony. The title of Arbiter is to be a mark of shame, but is restoring it to one of honor through his actions. The elites now seeing past the propaganda and treating him as he is. This is followed up by an intense vehicle section laced with the main theme. A moment this large and empowering has finally been afforded to the Arbiter after he's earned back some of the respect of his people. It's not quite as cathartic and rewarding as it appears to be intended to be, as the switching back and forth of perspective has meant these explosive vehicle sections haven't exactly been rare, but it's a nice moment in the Arbiter's journey regardless. It also feels different on a gameplay level as you're facing Flood in vehicles rather than Covenant. The Flood stay in character even when behind the wheel. They're much more aggressive and still harbour that dismissal of self-preservation. You notice this especially with those in the Ghosts, as they love to boost right into you, blowing the both of you up. Another thing this level does well is really propel the looming threat and hone in on the mission's fragility. Things feel quite dire as you see the smoking structure on the horizon amongst Forerunner debris and well-equipped Flood, then coming into keener focus as you make your way forward on foot, surrounded by the burnt orange and brown metal that by now you're so used to seeing in its polished grey state. This mission is kinetic, dynamic, and quite large in scale, creating a diverse flow of combat overall. That being said, it's also probably the hardest mission in the game. With so much going on, it's easy to get overwhelmed, and the tighter spaces that Halo 2's combat excels within make that even more likely to happen. The game is generally pretty easy, though not brain dead, but this level, and the one before it to some extent, crank things up a decent amount. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it's the true re-emergence of the Flood that has done it, just like it did with the library in Halo 1. And like that game, this mode of difficulty isn't really compelling as much as it is frustrating, so it's unfortunate that some of those same issues are cropping up again in the second game. The Arbiter eventually makes it to the gondola that'll take him to the Index, with the Spec Ops commander trailing behind him. The burgeoning respect we saw earlier comes to fruition here, as the commander offers to stay back and defend so the Arbiter can go on. After fending off the Flood in a painstakingly slow auto-scroller section, Arbiter comes to the library. Despite this mission's faults, seeing the Flood all already killed by UNSC as you near the Index is very satisfying. God, I'm only now realizing just how much I dislike the library in Halo 1. We see Keyes reach out and grab the icon, helped along by Johnson. The Arbiter disarms them both before Tartarus grabs Miranda and the Index, once again swooping in to take credit for the Arbiter's work. He then readies his hammer to fire the Arbiter into the pit behind him, revealing that the Prophets themselves ordered the betrayal.
Fool. They ordered me to do it.
What is that?
I am a monument to all your sins.
The two perspectives finally overlap as we see that both the Arbiter and Master Chief have been saved by the Gravemind, the central intelligence of the Flood. The Gravemind has some raw fucking lines, living up to his position as the bringer of apocalypse. In Genesis 6:5, it's stated that the Flood we see in the story of Noah was sent as humans at the time had become wholly evil in their hearts, essentially making the Flood, and in our subject the Gravemind, a monument to all our sins. The Gravemind will also speak in rhyme occasionally, giving this theatrical, performed and pre-scripted feel to his speech. It makes him appear omniscient, as though predicting what will happen and so knowing just what to say, while also mirroring the idea that we know these stories due to the fact that they were written and passed down over time. The Gravemind basically lays things out as they are. Master Chief is steadfast, firm and decided in his objective and belief, or lack thereof, in the Great Journey. Then the Arbiter is emotionally conflicted, somewhat disillusioned with his place but ultimately still bought into the Prophet's lies. He then shows the two of them 2401 Penitent Tangent, Delta Halo's monitor, and the infected Prophet of Regret, again contrasting someone operating off pure truth, and the other off misguided, misinterpreted faith. Interestingly, both of their names express similar things. Penitent means feeling bad for committing sin or wrongdoing, essentially regret. These connections help lay the groundwork for how the two central perspectives of the game will be equalized going forward. The Gravemind lays out that the firing of the ring will kill all life. The Great Journey is not what the prophets say it is. The Arbiter is given a chance to see the truth, sent to one place where the index may be in order to stop the ring, Master Chief sent to another. On High Charity, we see the beginning of an intercovenant revolt, while Truth tries to placate them with more trite religious musings. Master Chief has conveniently been teleported to this very room because apparently the Gravemind, a parasite, has that ability. Truth escapes with the index and Master Chief resolves to find him. You finally get a chance to fight the brutes, and they're interesting. With no shields, it's instead best to focus on their heads, which typically isn't as much of a priority in Halo in comparison to other FPSs. Once their helmet's taken care of, you can take them out with a couple shots to the dome, but if only one brute is left, it'll berserk, becoming incredibly tough and running right at you. This creates a new arc and dynamic to combat. Decisions around what enemies you engage with are being made regularly, as the brutes are the toughest enemies, so common wisdom is to focus on them, but once only one is left, it gets up in your face and draws your attention, leaving the rest of the foes to get some easy shots in. The needs of a fight feel more fragile and fluid when up against brutes, making for some compelling encounters, but also a sense of exhaustion, as you're going to be fighting a fuckload of brutes from here on out. At the very least, it's refreshing to get a new enemy type this late in the game, and there's a legitimate learning curve to fighting them that proves to be pretty rewarding. The brutes also give you access to two new weapons. The Brute Shot is a grenade launcher, a nice intermediary between standard firearms and power weapons that fits nicely into the sandbox. It's also shockingly easy to shoot right between Covenant legs with it. I swear the auto-aim centers on this spot with the Brute Shot just to fuck with you. The Brute Plasma Rifle is a stronger variant of the Plasma Rifle that I believe is quicker to overheat. I like the new colour scheme, but the difference between it and the standard version is pretty negligible. It's not immediately apparent and doesn't really shake up combat in any meaningful way. The level design is at least pretty strong here. High Charity is able to play directly into Halo 2's strengths. The environments sometimes feel exactly like multiplayer arenas with slick routes of movement and many angles of access. The game uses the fictional locale to leverage plausible deniability. You don't know enough about the Covenant to really question why these rooms are designed like this. It's easy to hand wave away and get on shooting. As you descend the tower, Truth sends out broadcasts about his safety, which Cortana is able to track. As you follow that lead, you see the elites and brutes fighting, tensions finally boiling over. A touch I like is how sometimes brutes will be in the zealot garb, and other times elites will be. With it on, they become hard to tell apart, as though saying that when working in service of these power-hungry leaders like Truth, these two warring factions aren't all that different. They're ultimately vying for a part to play in their own eventual destruction. Something else you feel as you traverse High Charity is this focus on weightless, lift-based movement between rooms and sections of the city. It feels ethereal and formless, a mode of transport that relies on faith somewhat, as we see when you first go to enter one.
It's safe, really. Just step in.
It ties in well to the energy and plasma-based aesthetic of the Covenant, which flows organically amongst its elements to create spaces full of sleek, natural curves that obscure the Covenant hegemony's true identity as a rigid hierarchy. This also carries over to some of the music in this level, airy, heavenly vocals that contrast nicely with Truth's lies and the Brute's proud cruelty. As you close in on Truth, the in amber-clad enters High Charity via slip space rupture, Cortana soon getting readings of Flood leaving the wreckage. We see Johnson push to one phantom and keys to another as infection forms swarm the platform, managing to get a hold of Mercy, Truth stopping Tartarus from saving him.
The great journey awaits for no one, brother. Not even you.
In line with the breadth of contrast between Master Chief and the Arbiter being lessened, we're back in the Arbiter's perspective after one mission instead of the standard 2. He's been dropped near the ring's control room. Although he's been confronted by the Prophet's betrayal, there's still time left in his journey, exemplified by the understated, quiet start to this post-Gravemind mission compared to Master Chief's. This start is a major turning point in the Arbiter, thanks to a few things. The main one is the fact that you spend a couple minutes weaving around elite corpses, including the high-ranking councillors, with brutes mocking their deaths. Not only have the prophets betrayed him, but also his people, left the elites to die at the hands of their more blindly loyal subjects. The music at this point is soft and angelic, as though actually alluding to the passing of life. We also see at the start that he picks up a plasma rifle at his feet. This weapon is most associated with the elites. This detail is telling us that the narrative focus is on the Arbiter reflecting on how his brethren have been treated. This opening really effectively communicates the cruelty of the situation before lifting things up a bit. You soon meet up with some elites, vowing to take revenge, at which point some drums are cleverly implemented into the music. This sets the groundwork for combat that feels retributive and vengeful.
Here is another. You're not all dead? Raise the alarm!
As you continue, the drums drop out once more, regrounding the atmosphere to make sure you don't forget what's ultimately driving the Arbiter throughout the mission. The ability of the music to guide tone here is on the level of the silent cartographer from Halo 1. There it was scoring an intense push forward, trying to evoke the grandiosity of triumphant war movies, but here it's restrained and pared down, and shows that while some of the design in Halo 2 doesn't quite hold up, the music most certainly does. Even when the music does get more blood pumping during intense vehicle sections, it feels driven by keys rather than percussion, never belying the intent to truly hammer home the Arbiter's motivation, and how it may be causing him to think about the hegemony's beliefs and structure. Closer to the control room, you enter into a large canyon where the Spec Ops commander happens to be. As he approaches in a wraith, you see the Arbiter's recent thoughts manifesting, backing away from it, no longer trusting it and the Covenant as a whole. You see the two phantoms from High Charity landing, one landing on the control room so Tartarus can get keys to enter the Index, as Reclaimers, or humans, can only perform the task. Stepping back in time a little, Master Chief arrives right as the Phantoms leave for the control room, spotting Mercy struggling for his life. He tells Chief that Truth's headed to Earth via the Forerunner ship in High Charity's center. Master Chief is to head after Truth, while Cortana stays behind in High Charity's systems, so she can detonate the In-Amber Clad, destroying the city and Delta Halo, similar to Combat Evolved. As they discuss the plan, a Pelican crashes in, releasing more flood into the city. Gravemind used the Arbiter and Master Chief as a distraction, so it could use In-Amber Clad to carry the flood to High Charity. The merging of Chief and Arbiter's perspectives continues here. These past few missions have seen their identities overlap somewhat. The Arbiter is the one directly trying to stop the firing of the ring, searching for the Index and then trying to stop Tartarus now that he knows the truth. While Master Chief sees High Charity and the Covenant at large splinter and begin tearing itself apart. Based on who they are, you'd expect those circumstances to be flipped. And they are in the beginning when Chief is on Earth and Arbiter doing the Prophet's bidding, but that dynamic has shifted as they've become more alike and aligned. While you still are on High Charity, gameplay is kept different enough by not just the flood, but also the open caverns connected by grav lifts and dark, tight spaces packed with warring flood and Covenant. This is reflected by Truth and Gravemind broadcasting messages back and forth. It gives this feeling of desperation, of all this being much, much larger than you. They both absolutely have to be stopped. It's the first time in the game Master Chief hasn't felt idolized and empowered. Combat is tense and important, imbued with intent and meaning that previous encounters featuring him have lacked. Those instead feeling like inevitable victories built off slick, smooth gunplay. The game's bringing him back down to earth somewhat, as though preparing to meet Arbiter halfway in how they're treated by the narrative. Master Chief makes it to the Prophet's quarters, barely launching himself into the Forerunner ship as it disengages from High Charity, promising to come back for Cortana once he's done with Truth.
Get to Earth. Good luck.
after I'm through with truth.
Don't make a girl a promise if you know you can't keep it.
What is that place? Where the counselors were meant to watch the consecration of the icon. The start of the great journey.
There is still time to stop the key from turning.
I must get inside. Then mount up, Arbiter.
Moving into the final mission, the Arbiter needs to get into the ring's control room, so takes the commander's Wraith to blast his way through the canyon ahead, before storming a Forerunner-built outpost with hunters and elites at his side. There's a tremendous sense of forward momentum here, of confidence in your goal and what it will take to achieve it. The brooding hesitation that defined the mood of the last time we were in his shoes is largely gone, now surging forward with purpose. This carries on as instead of avenging fallen covenants, you get an opportunity to save some taken prisoner. It shows that the Arbiter hasn't broken away from the entirety of the covenant, but instead its hierarchs and leaders. Not long after, you exit back into the open air, killing the brutes that are guarding the UNSC prisoners. Johnson is among them and he enters the Scarab tank, hoping to use its cannon to blast open the control room doors. You provide support from the air, showing the first bit of active cooperation and collaboration between Covenant and humans, again demonstrating the Arbiter's journey and arc. This shows the Hegemony's hardware being co-opted and, in the Arbiter's case, reclaimed, to be used for good, to stop the firing of Delta Halo. It shows that these icons of the Covenant, and by extension what the Covenant ostensibly stand for, their faith, can be a force for good. When someone like the Arbiter, who's married his faith with the truth, makes use of them, they serve an honourable purpose. There's also the fact that the last time we used the Banshee so prominently was when hunting the Heretics, who we now know knew the truth thanks to Guilty Spark, demonstrating how the Arbiter's changed. The working together of Covenant and humans is emphasised as well by the combination of using Covenant vehicles, while music more reminiscent of the UNSC plays to accent the action. Dramatic strings and vociferous drum crashes lead the composition instead of the divinely mysterious vocal layers we're used to when playing as the Arbiter. While that's thematically rich, the actual gameplay isn't all that. Like I said, I'm not too big on the Banshee, but hey, I at least like what's being said. Sergeant Johnson eventually cracks the doors open and you land the Banshee to enter. Inside the chamber, Tartarus attempts to force Miranda to enter the Index. He's stopped as the Arbiter and Johnson hold him up, getting 343 to explain the ring's purpose. The Arbiter tries to stress that the Prophets have betrayed their people, but Tartarus refuses to accept it. Blinded by his lust for control and status, he quickly shoves the Index in using Miranda's hand and begins the firing process. Jumping onto the central platforms, Tartarus attempts to defend the beginning of the Great Journey. This proves to be another atrocious boss fight. Tartarus can be deadly with his hammer, but of course he has to be close and you have weapons that can be used at range. Additionally, some random elites just appear to help once the fight starts, so he's usually distracted with them while you just fire away. I think there is meant to be a strategy here to take down his shield and do more damage, but I never figured out what it was. The fight was too quick. I won't belabor this point too much. The boss suffers from the same problems as the one against Regret and the Heretic. With the platform cleared, Keyes is free to remove the Index, prematurely stopping the firing sequence. Due to the ring shutting down, a beacon is sent out to the other rings, readying them for remote activation. One would only have to find the Ark to fire all Halo rings at once. We see the Forerunner ship enter Earth's aerospace. Lord Hood sends an order to take it out, before Master Chief chimes in.
One of ours. Take it out.
This is Spartan 117.
Can anyone hear me? Over.
Isolate that signal. Master Chief, you mind telling me what you're doing on that ship?
Sir, finishing this fight.
Yep, the game that was advertised as you saving Earth from the Covenant ends with Master Chief saying that he's going to save the Earth from the Covenant. It's just a really bad ending, there's no way around it. It attempts to set up a cliffhanger by establishing the Ark and what the Covenant could do with it, but this makes for a very direct cliffhanger. You know what's going to happen next, it doesn't leave you guessing about the directions the narrative could go. so rather than ending on an interesting note with compelling implications, it just gets cut off, ending abruptly and disappointingly, no doubt thanks to the final act that had to be cut. These cuts can also be felt elsewhere in the game, primarily in level design and structure. There's of course the few instances where what was supposed to be one level just got straight chopped in half and made into two, but that's not the worst of it. That comes in with the prevalence of wave-based and auto-scrolling sequences. There are many times where it feels like the levels are just happening around you, either by blocking the way forward and letting out 3 to 5 waves of enemies one after the other, complete with awkward pauses between them, or by placing you on something very slow moving, again taking out groups of enemies along the way. This even applies to vehicle sections sometimes, which are so linear that the vehicular aspect of it is pointless, it may as well be moving on its own. These ideas aren't bad in isolation. Wave-based combat can be fun, but in Halo 2 it all feels very contrived and padded. There's little effort made to justify why all these Covenant are waiting around until it's their turn to run in and get killed. Many encounters and sequences seem content with coasting on the implicit understanding that if Covenant or Flood are in front of you, then you gotta kill them. This in turn kills motivation and momentum when you're playing, in the process pulling down other aspects of the game. But it's not all bad. In fact, in many places on High Charity in particular, you will fight through multiple similar rooms not too far apart from each other. This is, in effect, very similar to those wave-based encounters, but the fact that you're the one pushing forward and seeming to make progress to a tangible, achievable goal is what makes those sequences and fights feel important. Beyond that, there are some really great missions and moments. Moving through Delta Halo as Chief is a great time and shows that Halo 2's sandbox and gunplay can allow for some more open spaces. It's vibrant, varied, and really compelling stuff. That also goes for Mission 13, Uprising, as the Arbiter. It captures a fantastic mood and capitalizes on the narrative context to craft unique arcs to gameplay, where you start out alone and isolated, before finding allies and fronting an offensive, all while the underlying mood retains its place. Even amongst the good and bad level design, gunplay typically remains at least pretty fun, and at the most, pretty amazing. The biggest improvement is of course with movement. It shows an understanding of how space, place, and circumstance build Halo 1's encounters, then adding another dimension on top of it to create room for fluid, slick sequences of gunplay. The weapon sandbox has been simultaneously diversified and streamlined. There's generally more coverage for how a player would like to play without too many superfluous weapons. There are some that are underutilized, like the fuel rod cannon, but even they don't feel totally pointless, still harboring some unique properties to solidify their place within the game. The story ends up following the tone of this conclusion so far, that being distinct good and bad. The Arbiter and his journey is really great. His arc and characterization is levels above Chief in Halo 1, and he helps provide much needed perspective so the game can deliver on its themes. The care Halo 2 takes in its critique of organized religion and how it manifests them within the Covenant is thorough and nuanced. There's tons of detail waiting to have insight taken from it. It feels incising of institution but respectful of individuals. At the same time, it manages to craft a thematic application that makes complete sense within the world. It's not too subtle on its surface, but there's never an impression that the game's ideas are being retroactively strung to the Covenant, which is part of what makes it work. You're not just absorbing the game's take on organized religion, but also drawing in-universe insight into how this collective works and operates. There's value to be gained just as a fan of Halo as a science fiction universe. But much of that never really gets pulled over to Master Chief. He acts as an effective foil to the Arbiter and serves as a point of comparison for the game's extrapolation of power dynamics and structures, but he himself is so boring. No longer shouldering the thematic weight of the game like he did in Combat Evolved, he's laid bare as an admittedly cool but also shallow one-liner machine that ultimately lacks impact. It's kind of fucked up that Master Chief feels like the least important part of this story. He obviously does a lot, like taking out Regret for example, but the narrative is so much more interested in the Arbiter that it's hard to really care about all that stuff. Which makes Halo 2 quite an interesting sequel. It does feel larger in scale than Halo 1, and in one half of the game it absolutely delivers on that. As I've said, the story stuff with the Arbiter is fantastic and is an especially unique direction for an FPS of the time. The majority of the level design is building off the very strong sandbox and core gunplay to deliver interesting combat sequences filled with many small but meaningful player decisions, and sometimes those positives interact to craft really rich, affecting and impressive moments within the game, like the aforementioned Mission 13. But there's also a lot of repetitive fights and empty narrative content. This dichotomy even extends to presentation to some extent, as the music is largely fantastic and used to great effect, while the visuals look kinda dull and drab. Halo 2 is a sequel built around contrast, juxtaposition, duality, and shifting perspective. Unfortunately, its own execution ends up becoming a part of that with its ups and downs in quality, but I still really respect it for going where it went and managing to deliver where it really mattered, for the most part. It's not quite as magical as Halo 1, but there's lots to love, and it's an incredibly important part of the series' legacy for a good reason.